May 20th, 1969. Hill 937, A Shau Valley, Vietnam. After 10 days of continuous assault, 4 battalions of American and South Vietnamese troops finally reached the summit. The hill is theirs. 630 North Vietnamese soldiers lie dead in the bunkers and tunnels. 72 Americans are dead, 372 wounded. The kill ratio is nearly 9-1. The commanders call it a victory. The statistics prove it. The enemy regiment has been destroyed. The objective has been taken. And then, 16 days later, on June 5th, the American military abandons the hill, walks away, leaves it to the jungle. Within weeks, North Vietnamese forces reoccupy the same ridge that cost American lives to capture. The soldiers who fought there learned their friends died for ground their own command decided was worthless before the bodies were cold. This is Hamburger Hill. And it is the moment the American strategy in Vietnam, the belief that killing more enemy soldiers than you lose equals victory, collapsed under the weight of its own logic, because the United States won this battle completely, dominated tactically, destroyed an elite enemy unit, and the victory accelerated American defeat. This is the story of how winning stopped meaning anything, how body counts became meaningless, how a hill taken at enormous cost and abandoned days later exposed the fundamental flaw in how America was fighting the war. Before we talk about the hill, you need to understand the valley. The A Shau Valley, 45 kilometers of jungle corridor running along the Laotian border in the western mountains of Thu Thien province. The locals called it different names depending on their allegiance. The Americans called it the most dangerous place in Vietnam. The valley was not just terrain. It was a strategic artery, a pipeline that funneled North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies from the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos directly toward the coastal cities of Hue and Da Nang. The geography created what military planners called the tube. Steep jungle mountains on both sides forming a natural corridor that was nearly impossible to observe from the air and extremely difficult to attack from the ground. For 3 years, since the fall of the Special Forces camp at A Shau in March 1966, the North Vietnamese Army had controlled the valley completely. They had built all-weather roads capable of supporting truck traffic, established massive supply caches, constructed an integrated air defense network with anti-aircraft guns positioned on the ridge lines. The valley had become a fortress. And from this fortress, the North Vietnamese had launched the attacks on Hue during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The city had been devastated. Thousands died. The battle to retake Hue took weeks of brutal urban combat, and the staging area for that attack, the place where troops massed and supplies were cached, was the A Shau Valley. By May 1969, American commanders had decided the valley could not be left inviolate. As long as the North Vietnamese controlled the A Shau, the coastal cities would never be secure. The question was how to break that control. The answer was Operation Apache Snow, a massive reconnaissance in force involving 10 battalions, elements of the 101st Airborne Division, the 9th Marine Regiment, and the South Vietnamese 1st Division. The plan was a hammer and anvil maneuver. Marines and South Vietnamese troops would establish blocking positions along the Laotian border and the valley floor. Airmobile infantry from the 101st would assault into the valley and sweep the ridges, driving the enemy against the blocking forces. The objective was not to hold the valley. That would require a permanent garrison the military did not have the manpower to sustain. The objective was destruction. Find the enemy, fix them in place, kill them, then leave. This was attrition warfare, the same strategy that had defined American operations since 1965. Victory measured not by ground held but by enemy soldiers killed. The logic was mathematical. If you could kill them faster than they could be replaced, eventually you would win. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Racassins, drew the northern sector of the valley. Their area of operations was dominated by a single mountain rising 937 meters above sea level. The locals called it Dong Ap Bia, the mountain of the crouching beast. Intelligence suggested the mountain was lightly defended. The expectation was that North Vietnamese forces would conduct a fighting withdrawal, delay the American advance, then fade back into Laos before the full weight of U.S. firepower could be brought to bear. That expectation was wrong. The North Vietnamese 29th Regiment was waiting on that mountain. This was not a local guerrilla unit. The 29th was an elite formation of the People's Army of Vietnam, battle-hardened regulars who had been fighting for years. They were called the Pride of Ho Chi Minh, and they had orders to hold Dong Ap Bia to protect the valley's logistics network. They had turned the mountain into a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Bunkers dug deep into the earth and reinforced with layers of teak logs and packed soil, positioned in concentric rings up the slopes with overlapping fields of fire, roofed with more logs and earth to withstand artillery airbursts, camouflaged so perfectly that American soldiers would walk past active positions without seeing them until the shooting started. Tunnel networks connected the bunkers, allowing defenders to move between positions without exposure, to resupply ammunition, to evacuate wounded, to shift forces to meet attacks from different directions. The entire mountain was an interconnected defensive system designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. And the North Vietnamese had developed tactics specifically to negate American firepower advantages. They fought at extremely close range, 10 to 20 meters when possible, close enough that American troops could not call in artillery or airstrikes without hitting their own positions. The North Vietnamese called it grabbing the belt buckle. Get close enough that the enemy cannot use his technological superiority. The Racassans were about to walk into this fortress, with the expectation that it would be a light fight. May 10th, the air assault began at first light. Helicopters ferried companies of the 3rd Battalion into landing zones northwest of the mountain. Initial contact was light, sniper fire, harassment, the kind of resistance that suggested the enemy was withdrawing. On May 11th, Bravo Company pushed toward the summit. Captain Charles Littman led his men up the steep ridges through jungle so thick visibility was measured in meters. The terrain was brutal, narrow ridges with sheer drops on both sides, single-file movement, thick bamboo and elephant grass 8 feet tall that slashed exposed skin. Then the jungle exploded. AK-47 fire, heavy machine guns, RPG explosions. The volume of fire was overwhelming and disciplined. Bravo Company was pinned. Men were hit and could not be evacuated. The only way out was back down the ridge the way they had come. When they recovered a body, they found documents identifying the unit, 29th Regiment, not a delaying force, not a harassment element, a full regiment with orders to fight. Over the next 5 days, the pattern repeated: assault, heavy fire, casualties, withdrawal, artillery and airstrikes would pound the mountain, thousands of shells, hundreds of bombs, napalm that turned sections of jungle into walls of flame. And when the bombardment lifted and the infantry went back up, the bunkers were still there. The defenders would emerge from the tunnels and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt commanded the 3rd Battalion. His call sign was Blackjack. He was aggressive, relentless. He believed that speed and momentum saved lives, that hesitation allowed the enemy to reinforce and cost more casualties in the long run. He ordered continuous assaults from multiple directions. But the terrain defeated momentum. The ridges funneled entire companies into single-file columns. Only the lead squad could fight. A few North Vietnamese machine gunners in bunkers could halt a 100-man company. When one company was stopped, another would try a different approach. Same result. The fighting was intimate and exhausting. Soldiers moved through shredded jungle, the vegetation destroyed by bombardment, leaving a moonscape of mud and splintered trees. They fought through monsoon rains that turned the slopes into slides of slick mud. Men lost their footing on the 45-degree inclines and slid backward, weaponless, while under fire. And the casualties mounted. Every day, men killed by machine gun fire from bunkers they could not see until they were already in the kill zone. Men wounded and stuck on exposed slopes because evacuation helicopters could not land under fire. Men exhausted beyond anything training had prepared them for, fighting the same ground repeatedly, dying for the same few meters of jungle. On May 18th, the intensity increased. General Melvin Zeiss, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, committed additional battalions. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, assaulted from the south, while the 3rd Battalion attacked from the north. A coordinated push designed to overwhelm the defenses. But the weather intervened. A tropical storm slammed into the valley. The denuded slopes became impossible to climb, and in the chaos of the storm, a Cobra gunship, disoriented by weather and terrain, fired rockets into the American command position. Friendly fire. 2 soldiers killed, 35 wounded, including the company commander. The morale impact was devastating. Men were being killed by their own side. The mountain had become a meat grinder, and still the orders were to attack. By May 19th, the military logic was clear. The 3rd Battalion could not take the hill alone, so General Zeiss committed everything. 4 battalions would assault simultaneously, American and South Vietnamese troops attacking from multiple directions. Overwhelming force applied to a single objective. The final bombardment began on the morning of May 20th. 2 hours of continuous artillery fire, 20,000 shells, over 1,000 tons of bombs including napalm. The summit was obscured by smoke and dust. The sound was continuous, a roar that made communication impossible except by hand signal. At 10 in the morning, the assault began. The 3rd Battalion led, companies that had been reduced to half strength by 10 days of fighting, men who had not slept more than a few hours in that entire time, who had watched friends die on these same slopes days earlier, but they went up again. By noon, the lead elements breached the final defensive line, found the summit a ruin of shattered bunkers and cratered earth, bodies everywhere, equipment scattered. The North Vietnamese had begun withdrawing during the night, melting back into Laos, but rearguard elements fought to the death. At 1700 hours, 5 in the afternoon, Hill 937 was declared secure. The kill count was impressive. 630 North Vietnamese soldiers confirmed dead, likely more buried in collapsed bunkers or carried away during the withdrawal. Weapons captured. Documents recovered. By the metrics of attrition warfare, this was a decisive victory. American casualties, 72 killed, 372 wounded. South Vietnamese casualties, 31 killed. The ratio was approximately 9-1 in favor of American and Allied forces. For the commanders, the numbers proved the operation's success. An elite enemy regiment had been destroyed. The threat they posed to operations in the valley was eliminated. The cost was acceptable within the framework of attrition strategy. You would always take casualties, but as long as you inflicted more than you suffered, you were winning. General Zeiss defended the operation vigorously. It's a myth that if we don't do anything, nothing will happen to us. If we pulled back, they'd kill us in the night. They'd come on and crawl under the wire. They'd drop satchel charges on our bunkers. Better to engage them on a remote hill than fight them in the streets of Hue or inside American fire bases. The logic was preemptive destruction. Find the enemy before they can attack you. Destroy them where the terrain favors their defense rather than wait for them to attack where you are vulnerable. But this logic existed in a purely military framework. It measured success by enemy killed versus friendly casualties. It ignored the political dimension, the reality that the American public was watching, counting American dead, and questioning whether the war had any end point. June 5, 1969, 16 days after the hill was taken. Major General John Wright, who had succeeded Zeiss as division commander, ordered the abandonment of Hill 937. The military rationale was consistent with the operation's original objectives. Apache Snow was a raid, not an occupation. The mission was to destroy the enemy regiment, not hold the hill permanently. The 29th Regiment had been routed. Their bunkers were destroyed. The objective was accomplished. Maintaining a static garrison on the hill would be tactically problematic. The position was remote. Resupply would be difficult during monsoon season. The hill commanded no vital roads or population centers, and a fixed position would be vulnerable to constant mortar attacks from the surrounding mountains. General Zeiss stated, "This is not a war of hills." That hill had no military value whatsoever. So the Americans left, walked back down the mountain, evacuated by helicopter. The hill returned to the jungle. Within weeks, intelligence reported that North Vietnamese forces were reoccupying the A Shau Valley. Moving back onto the same ridges the Rakkasans had bled to clear. By July, enemy activity in the area had returned to pre-operation levels. For the soldiers who had fought there, the abandonment was devastating. They had watched friends die on that mountain, had assaulted bunkers repeatedly, had endured 10 days of some of the most intense fighting of the war, and the ground they had taken, the objective they had been told was important enough to die for, was given back without a fight. The message was unmistakable. The hill never mattered. The enemy regiment mattered. Once they were destroyed, the ground had no value. But to the men who had fought there, this distinction was meaningless. They had not been told they were fighting to destroy a regiment. They had been told to take a hill, and now that hill was abandoned. The psychological impact was profound. If the hill did not matter, why did 72 Americans die taking it? If the plan was always to leave, why were they ordered to assault fortified bunkers repeatedly instead of just surrounding the position and starving the enemy out? These questions had no good answers, because the real answer was that the military strategy was based on metrics, body counts, and kill ratios that made sense in briefing rooms but not on the ground. The strategy measured success by destruction, not by lasting effects. While the military debated tactics, the American public was learning about Hamburger Hill through a very different lens. The battle was covered extensively by journalists embedded with the units. J. Sharbut of the Associated Press filed dispatches that focused not on the tactical success but on the human cost. The repeated frontal assaults, the exhausted soldiers, the mounting casualties, the bitterness in the ranks. One soldier, when asked about the fighting, told reporters, "Have you ever been inside a hamburger machine? We just got cut to pieces." The nickname stuck. Hamburger Hill, the place where men were ground up like meat. On June 27th, Life magazine published an issue that became one of the defining images of the war's opposition. The cover featured the faces of the American dead in Vietnam, 1 week's toll. Inside were photographs of 242 American soldiers killed during a single week in late May. Only a handful had died on Hill 937, but the public made the connection. These were the faces of attrition. Young men, mostly draftees, disproportionately working class, who died for objectives the military abandoned days later. The political backlash was immediate and unprecedented. On May 20th, the same day Hill 937 was secured, Senator Edward Kennedy took to the Senate floor and denounced the operation. He called the battle senseless and irresponsible and stated, "American boys are too valuable to be sacrificed for a false sense of military pride." This was extraordinary. A sitting senator publicly attacking the professional military judgment of field commanders during an active operation, accusing them not of tactical mistakes but of moral failure. of wasting American lives for pride rather than strategic necessity. The attack resonated because it captured what many Americans were feeling. The war had been going on for years. The body counts kept climbing. The military kept announcing victories, but there was no end in sight. No progress that civilians could see. Just more casualties for hills that were abandoned. More statistics that did not translate into anything that looked like winning. Hamburger Hill became the symbol of this futility, a perfect encapsulation of attrition warfare's bankruptcy. High casualties, impressive kill ratios, total tactical success, immediate abandonment, enemy return, the cycle that defined the war. The political consequences were immediate. On June 8th, 3 days after Hill 937 was abandoned, President Richard Nixon met with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu at Midway Island. Nixon announced the first withdrawal of American troops. 25,000 soldiers would leave Vietnam by August. This was the formal beginning of Vietnamization, the policy of transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while drawing down American presence. Historians argue that the public outcry over Hamburger Hill provided the political pressure Nixon needed to override military commanders who wanted to maintain maximum pressure on the enemy. The battle had strategic consequences far beyond the A Shau Valley. It accelerated American withdrawal. It gave political cover to those arguing the war was unwinnable, and it destroyed what remained of public faith in the military's strategic judgment. For the men who fought on Hill 937, the political debates in Washington were abstractions. Their war was more immediate, more personal. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt, Blackjack, became a lightning rod for soldier anger. He had driven his battalion relentlessly, ordered assault after assault, refused to accept that the hill could not be taken. To Honeycutt, speed and aggression saved lives by ending the battle quickly rather than letting it drag on. But to his exhausted men, his aggression looked like careerism paid for in their blood. The GI Underground newspaper published a $10,000 bounty on Honeycutt's head. While no attempt was ever made on his life, the existence of the bounty revealed something profound: the breakdown of trust between soldiers and their officers, the perception that career officers, lifers, were using draftees as expendable resources to advance their careers through impressive body counts. Frank Bacha, a platoon leader in Bravo Company, later wrote about the experience in his memoir. He described the mindless carnage of repeated assaults, the surreal horror of fighting an enemy who lived underground and emerged only to kill, the smell of the mountain, cordite and rotting vegetation and blood, the nobility of ordinary soldiers who kept fighting despite apparent futility. But beneath the accounts of courage and horror was a deeper question that haunted survivors. What had it been for? Veteran Gerald Harkins later explained, "The hill itself had no meaning. It was just a piece of dirt. The thing that made it important to us was the NVA unit there." This distinction, fighting to destroy an enemy unit rather than to hold ground, made sense in the abstract logic of attrition warfare. But it was psychologically devastating in practice, because soldiers bond with the ground they fight for. They remember specific trees, specific bunkers, specific meters of trail where friends died. And when that ground is abandoned, it feels like the deaths were meaningless. The 101st Airborne would return to the A Shau Valley multiple times over the next 2 years. Operation Montgomery Rendezvous in July '69. Additional operations in '70 and '71, fighting over the same terrain, taking hills and leaving them, the cycle continuing. And every time the question returned, what are we accomplishing? If we keep fighting for the same ground, if the enemy keeps coming back, what does winning even mean? Hamburger Hill exposed the fundamental flaw in attrition strategy. It assumed both sides were playing the same game. The American military calculated victory through mathematics, kill ratios, enemy casualties versus friendly casualties. the crossover point where you were killing them faster than they could be replaced. If the numbers favored you, you were winning. The North Vietnamese calculated victory through endurance. They were fighting a political war where the goal was not to defeat the American military, but to outlast American political will. Every year the war continued without decisive American victory eroded support at home. Every casualty, even at 9-to-1 ratios, contributed to that erosion. The Americans needed tactical victories to demonstrate progress. The North Vietnamese just needed to not lose decisively until American public support collapsed. Hamburger Hill was a perfect tactical victory by American standards. 9-to-1 kill ratio, enemy regiment destroyed, objective seized, but the victory accelerated strategic defeat because it demonstrated that no amount of tactical success could produce lasting results. The enemy could absorb horrific casualties, withdraw, rebuild, and return. The cycle was endless. General Creighton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as MACV commander in '68, understood this problem. He had been trying to shift American strategy away from large unit attrition operations towards smaller actions focused on protecting population centers and interdicting logistics. His one war concept emphasized pacification and building South Vietnamese capability rather than hunting enemy main force units in remote jungles. But the ghost of Westmoreland's strategy still haunted the war. Commanders like Zeiss, who had built their careers in that system, still believed that destroying enemy units was the path to victory. They launched operations like Apache Snow because the doctrine they had learned said this was how you won. Hamburger Hill proved that doctrine was bankrupt, not because the tactics failed, the tactics worked perfectly, but because tactical success no longer translated into strategic progress. The hill was taken, the regiment was destroyed, and none of it mattered because the ground was not held, the enemy returned, and the political cost of the victory exceeded its military value. After Hamburger Hill, General Abrams issued new operational guidelines. The focus shifted from maximum pressure to protective reaction. American units would conduct smaller operations focused on protecting logistics and population centers rather than hunting enemy main force units. Battalion-sized search and destroy missions into remote areas, the operations that defined the war from '65 to '69, effectively ended. The age of attrition warfare was over, not because the military chose to end it, but because the political system forced the change. Hamburger Hill had demonstrated that the American public would no longer accept high casualties for objectives that were immediately abandoned. 6,500 words into this story, and we still have not answered the central question. What was Hamburger Hill actually about? Not the tactical details, not the bravery of the soldiers, not whether Honeycutt was right to press the attack or Zeiss was justified in committing additional battalions. Those are important questions, but they miss the larger truth. Hamburger Hill was about the moment. A military strategy collided with political reality and shattered. The strategy said, kill more enemy soldiers than you lose, and eventually you win. The reality said, the American people will not accept endless casualties without visible progress toward a defined end state. The strategy said, destroy enemy main force units wherever they concentrate. The reality said, destroying units in remote mountains does not create lasting security in coastal cities where the population lives. The strategy said, hold ground only if it has permanent strategic value. The reality said, soldiers and the public see abandoned ground as evidence that their sacrifices were wasted. These contradictions had existed throughout the war, but Hamburger Hill made them undeniable, made them visible in a way that could not be explained away by briefing charts and statistics. Because the sequence was so stark, 10 days of brutal fighting, impressive kill ratios, decisive tactical victory, and then abandonment 16 days later with the enemy returning within weeks. No amount of military logic could make that sequence look like winning to the American public. And once the public stopped believing that tactical victories meant progress toward victory, the war became politically unsustainable. That is the legacy of Hamburger Hill. Not the battle itself, but what the battle revealed. That the United States could win every engagement and still lose the war. That firepower dominance did not equal control. That body counts were a poor measure of success in a conflict where the enemy defined victory as outlasting you. The military learned these lessons, but at tremendous cost. The doctrinal changes that came after Hamburger Hill, the shift towards smaller operations, the emphasis on pacification, the recognition that population security mattered more than enemy casualties, came too late to change the war's outcome. Vietnamization proceeded. American forces withdrew, and in '75, Saigon fell. The soldiers who fought on Hill 937 did everything asked of them. They assaulted fortified positions repeatedly. They endured conditions that would break most people. They achieved the objective despite overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Their courage and skill were never in question. But courage and skill cannot overcome strategic bankruptcy, cannot substitute for achievable political objectives, cannot win a war where the definition of victory is unclear and the methods being used to pursue it undermine public support. That is the tragedy. Not that men died. Men die in every war. The tragedy is that they died executing a strategy that had already failed, that the tactical victories they achieved accelerated strategic defeat because each victory demonstrated the futility of the approach. If you visit the A Shau Valley today, you can still find Hill 937. The jungle has reclaimed it. The bunkers have collapsed or been swallowed by vegetation. There are no markers, no monuments. Just another mountain in a range of mountains. But the battle's impact on military thinking remains. Hamburger Hill is studied in war colleges as a case study in the limits of attrition warfare, as proof that tactical dominance does not guarantee strategic success, as evidence that wars are fundamentally political contests where military force is only decisive when applied toward achievable political objectives. The lessons apply beyond Vietnam. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces again demonstrated tactical superiority, again won virtually every engagement, again found that winning battles did not automatically translate into achieving political objectives. The parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Modern counterinsurgency doctrine, the focus on population security, institution building, minimizing civilian casualties, understanding political dynamics, emerged directly from Vietnam's lessons. Hamburger Hill is part of that educational foundation, a stark reminder that you can kill 10 enemy soldiers for every one of your own and still lose if you are fighting the wrong war. The soldiers who fought there deserve to have their story told accurately, not as heroes in a meaningless battle that diminishes their service, not as victims of incompetent commanders that ignores the complexity of the strategic situation, but as professionals who executed their mission under extraordinarily difficult conditions and achieved every tactical objective, only to discover that tactical success no longer mattered. They won the battle lost the war. Both things are true simultaneously. That is the final lesson of Hamburger Hill. The most important military victories are not always the ones with the best kill ratios or the most impressive tactical displays. They are the ones that produce lasting political effects, that advance achievable objectives, that create conditions that can be sustained after the shooting stops. Hill 937 was taken at great cost and abandoned shortly after. The enemy returned. The war ground on, and the American strategy that had guided operations for 4 years was exposed as bankrupt. 72 Americans died, proving that killing more was not the same as winning. That truth, written in blood on a remote mountain in 1969, remains relevant to every conflict fought since. The Hill mattered, not for the ground itself, but for what the battle revealed about the war America was fighting and the strategy that could not win it.